In the early hours of April 22, 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, age 40, made his way through the hallways of the Baikonur Cosmodrome with the grim awareness that he was probably headed towards certain death. He had been chosen to command Soyuz 1, marking the inaugural manned journey of the Soviet Union's newest spacecraft, which was built to surpass the United States Apollo initiative. However, Komarov was aware of information his commanders were concealing from the general population. Yuri Gagarin, Komarov's close friend and fellow space explorer, had made urgent appeals to mission officials to postpone the launch. More than 200 technical defects had been discovered in the Soyuz vehicle during tests conducted before flight, among them serious malfunctions in the parachute mechanism, unreliable attitude control, and defective bonding of the heat shield. Soviet technical experts had filed numerous reports outlining these hazardous flaws, yet political demands from the Kremlin took precedence over safety considerations. The launch was timed to align with Lenin's birthday celebration and the May Day military parade, offering Communist Party officials a propaganda triumph they urgently desired. Komarov grasped the no-win scenario he faced. Should he decline to participate in the flight, Yuri Gagarin, his backup, the first person to journey into space and a national icon, would fly in his stead. Komarov refused to allow his friend to perish in a vehicle he recognized as flawed. On April 23 at 3:35 a.m. Moscow time, Soyuz 1 launched from Baikonur into the darkness before sunrise. Malfunctions started occurring almost right away. One of the two solar arrays on the spacecraft didn't deploy correctly, reducing power output by 50% and preventing proper orientation toward the sun. With insufficient solar panel alignment, the craft's battery started depleting quickly. The ion sensors responsible for controlling the vehicle's orientation became faulty, resulting in Soyuz 1 tumbling out of control through space. Komarov struggled to manually stabilize his vessel, using valuable fuel supplies to activate the attitude control jets. Mission controllers watched the escalating problems with increasing concern. The scheduled meeting with Soyuz 2, set to launch the following day carrying 3 cosmonauts, was cancelled without delay. Following 18 progressively desperate orbital passes, ground controllers instructed Komarov to make an emergency descent over Soviet territory. When Soyuz 1 started its re-entry on April 24, Komarov manually positioned his craft for descent, aware that his survival hinged on systems that had already demonstrated their unreliability. The initial phase of descent through the upper atmospheric layers went as expected, with the heat shield safeguarding the crew area according to design, yet when the spacecraft decelerated to below the speed of sound at 23,000 feet altitude, the primary parachute housing didn't open correctly due to a design defect that technical personnel had flagged months before. The parachute became snarled inside its housing, offering almost no resistance to reduce the spacecraft's rate of fall. Komarov activated the reserve parachute mechanism, but it instantly became entangled with the half-deployed main parachute and the drogue chute, forming a knotted mass that was entirely useless. Ground-based Soviet monitoring stations captured Komarov's last communications as he hurtled earthward at more than 250 miles per hour. He angrily condemned the technical staff and administrators who had compelled him to pilot a faulty spacecraft, recognizing he had under a minute remaining to live. At 7:24 in the morning, Soyuz 1 hit the Earth near Orenburg with enormous impact, forming a depression and immediately setting fire to the spacecraft's leftover fuel. The collision was so catastrophic that the round descent capsule was utterly crushed into a disk measuring less than 1 meter in height. Komarov's remains were incinerated beyond identification, melted into the mangled metal of his craft. Recovery personnel needed hours to extract his body from the debris. His fatal mission compelled a thorough reorganization of the Soviet space initiative, postponing manned flights for a year and a half while technical staff redesigned the parachute mechanism and fixed hundreds of additional safety problems that political demands had compelled them to disregard. Soviet cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome aboard Soyuz 11 on June 6, 1971, commencing what seemed to be a standard mission to connect with Salyut 1, the planet's first functioning space station. The trio consisted of seasoned spaceflight professionals, with Dobrovolsky acting as mission leader, Volkov as flight engineer, and Patsayev as research engineer. their objective was to remain aboard the space station for 3 weeks, performing scientific tests and demonstrating that people could inhabit and function in space for prolonged durations. The launch went perfectly, and a day later, Soyuz 11 successfully connected with Salyut 1, making the team the initial humans to live on a space station. Throughout the following 22 days, the cosmonauts performed numerous experiments, encompassing astronomical studies, materials manufacturing, biological investigation, and photography of Earth. They set new records for spaceflight length and demonstrated that people could adjust to extended weightlessness. Their regular transmissions to ground control were positive and businesslike, showing no signs of any difficulties on the station. The team surpassed all their intended goals and even asked for extra experiments to occupy their leftover time. After finishing their extremely successful mission on June 29, the team closed the passages between Salyut 1 and their Soyuz 11 vehicle and got ready for the trip back to Earth. The separation process went normally at 21:28 Moscow time, with the craft cleanly detaching from the space station. 40 minutes afterward, the team activated their service module motor for the deorbit ignition, starting their fall toward a touchdown location in Kazakhstan. Every spacecraft component seemed to be working normally as Soyuz 11 penetrated the upper atmospheric layers. The service module and orbital module broke away from the descent module according to plan, leaving the 3 cosmonauts enclosed within the compact spherical pod that would transport them through re-entry and touchdown. The heat protection performed flawlessly, shielding the crew area from the severe heat produced by atmospheric resistance. The drogue parachute opened at the proper height, succeeded by the primary parachute, which unfurled correctly and decelerated the spacecraft to a secure descent velocity. The gentle landing engines activated automatically moments before contact, softening the impact as Soyuz 11 came to rest smoothly on the Kazakhstan steppe at 2:17 a.m. on June 30. Recovery aircraft were already overhead in circles, and ground teams hurried to the craft, anticipating congratulating 3 champions who had just established a new spaceflight endurance record. Upon the recovery squad opening the door of the descent capsule, they discovered all 3 cosmonauts still secured in their positions, unmoving, and with blue-tinged faces. There were no indications of collision injuries or flames, yet the men were unmistakably deceased. Medical analysis showed that the team had asphyxiated when a pressure equalization mechanism had activated too early during the descent phase, permitting the cabin air to escape into the emptiness of space. The mechanism was intended to balance cabin pressure with external atmosphere immediately before touchdown, but it had broken down and activated while the craft was still beyond the Kármán line at 550,000 feet altitude. The cabin lost pressure in only 112 seconds, producing swift decompression that the unshielded team couldn't withstand. Analysis showed that the mechanism had been harmed during the separation phase when explosive fasteners detonated to eject the orbital and service sections. A fastener or fragment of wreckage had harmed the valve apparatus, making it activate at the incorrect moment. The team had probably become unconscious within 15 to 20 seconds after decompression started and perished within 60 seconds from oxygen deprivation. The catastrophe resulted in substantial modifications in Soviet craft construction, encompassing strengthened pressure mechanisms and the mandate that teams wear pressure garments during all launch and re-entry procedures, a standard that persists presently. Space Shuttle Challenger rested on Launchpad 39B at Kennedy Space Center on the morning of January 28, 1986, prepared for its 10th journey into space. The team of 7 comprised Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, a secondary school educator from New Hampshire, chosen as the initial member in NASA's Teacher in Space initiative. The launch had experienced multiple postponements because of meteorological conditions and technical problems, building increasing demands from NASA leadership and the press to advance with the mission. The evening prior to launch, technical staff at Morton Thiokol, the firm that produced the shuttle's solid rocket propulsion units, found that nighttime temperatures had fallen to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, considerably beneath the lowest temperature at which the rubber O-ring gaskets in the rocket propulsion units had undergone testing. Lead engineers Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald vigorously urged delaying the launch, cautioning that the rigid O-rings might fail to seal correctly and might permit hot exhaust to leak from the rocket engines. Throughout an intense teleconference that continued until midnight, NASA administrators questioned Thiokol's worries, contending that there existed no definitive evidence that freezing weather would trigger seal breakdown. Facing severe demands to prevent another postponement, Thiokol leadership contradicted their own technical staff and authorized NASA to advance with the launch. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with numerous onlookers present, encompassing McAuliffe's relatives and pupils from her educational institution, Challenger ascended into a cloudless azure sky. The shuttle's 3 primary motors and 2 solid rocket propulsion units operated normally throughout the initial 60 seconds of flight, propelling the craft toward orbit. Nevertheless, at 59 seconds following liftoff, rapid capture cameras detected a tiny blaze emerging near the lower connection of the right solid rocket propulsion unit. The rigid O-rings had malfunctioned precisely as the technical staff had forecasted, permitting extremely hot exhaust at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit to leak and function like a cutting torch against the external fuel container. The blaze quickly expanded, consuming through the support that attached the right propulsion unit to the external container and compromising the container's structural supports. At 72 seconds into the journey, moving at Mach 1.92 at 48,000 feet altitude, the weakened external container ruptured, discharging thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen that combined explosively. The enormous blast didn't immediately end the crew's lives. The crew area, constructed to endure the pressures of launch and re-entry, was expelled from the blast and started descending toward the Atlantic Ocean in a ballistic trajectory. Emergency oxygen mechanisms activated on their own, and at minimum several of the team members were probably aware during the descent. Pilot Michael Smith was captured saying, "Oh," moments before the craft separated, showing that the team recognized something had failed disastrously. The crew area descended for 2 minutes and 45 seconds, achieving a velocity of more than 200 miles per hour before hitting the ocean surface 18 miles from shore. The collision with the water was unsurvivable, ending all 7 team members' lives immediately. NASA halted shuttle journeys for 32 months, during which a presidential inquiry examined the incident and enacted design modifications to avoid comparable breakdowns. The solid rocket propulsion units were totally rebuilt with enhanced O-ring gaskets and connection warmers to guarantee correct sealing in freezing weather. Space Shuttle Columbia ascended from Kennedy Space Center on January 16, 2003, transporting a team of 7 astronauts on a 16-day scientific investigation mission labeled STS-107. The team comprised Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, mission specialists Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, Michael Anderson, and payload specialist Elon Ramon. The mission was devoted to scientific investigation, with the team running more than 80 experiments in a research compartment situated in Columbia's cargo section. Throughout the launch, imaging equipment captured what seemed to be a substantial section of foam protection separating from the external fuel container's bipod ramp section and hitting Columbia's left wing leading boundary. The collision happened 81.7 seconds following liftoff when the shuttle was moving at roughly 1,568 miles per hour at 65,000 feet altitude. The foam section weighed roughly 1.67 pounds and measured approximately 21 by 27 inches. Rendering it significantly larger than normal wreckage that sometimes broke away from the external container. NASA technical staff examined the rapid capture film recording of the collision but determined that foam impacts were a frequent event that had never produced substantial harm on earlier missions. The Wreckage Evaluation Squad, consisting of technical staff from NASA and Boeing, asked for high-definition photographs of Columbia's wing from military observation equipment or optical instruments to evaluate the degree of any harm. Nevertheless, shuttle program administrators rejected this appeal, declaring that even if harm was discovered, nothing could be accomplished to fix it since Columbia wasn't outfitted for significant fixes and couldn't arrive at the International Space Station. This choice would become lethal, as the foam impact had genuinely produced serious harm to the wing's heat protection mechanism. The collision had formed an opening roughly 6 to 10 inches across in one of the strengthened carbon-carbon sections that shielded the wing's leading boundary during re-entry. Throughout the following 16 days, the team performed their scientific tests entirely unaware that their craft had sustained fatal harm. They finished all scheduled investigation tasks, functioning in rotations continuously to optimize the scientific benefit from their mission. Their regular transmissions with mission operations were standard and positive, showing no suggestion that anyone thought there was a difficulty with the shuttle. Columbia started its re-entry phase over the Pacific Ocean on February 1, 2003, activating its orbital control mechanism motors to decelerate and descend from orbit. While the shuttle fell through the upper atmospheric layers at more than 17,000 miles per hour, it started meeting the initial traces of atmospheric molecules that would slowly decelerate it through resistance. Initially, the re-entry advanced normally, with the team adhering to typical procedures for touchdown at Kennedy Space Center. Yet as Columbia fell through progressively concentrated atmosphere, extremely hot plasma started penetrating through the opening in the left wing's leading boundary. The heat within the wing framework rapidly exceeded 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond the liquefaction point of aluminum, and producing the wing's internal skeleton to break down. Detection devices across the left portion of the craft started recording unusual heat measurements and component breakdowns, but the team wasn't immediately cognizant of the seriousness of the circumstances. At 8:59 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, while moving over Texas at 207,000 feet altitude, Columbia's left wing ultimately broke away from the main body because of the structural harm produced by the extremely hot exhaust penetration. The shuttle immediately became impossible to pilot and separated because of aerodynamic pressures, with wreckage distributed across Texas and Louisiana. The crew area was obliterated in the separation, and all 7 astronauts perished immediately. The incident examination resulted in substantial modifications in shuttle procedures, encompassing thorough examinations of the heat protection mechanism on every mission and the ability to fix minor harm while in orbit. U.S. Air Force Major Michael J. Adams entered the pilot seat of X-15-3 at Edwards Air Force Base on November 15, 1967, for what would become his 7th journey in the test rocket aircraft. The 37-year-old experimental aviator had been chosen for the X-15 initiative based on his remarkable abilities piloting high-capability aircraft, and he was under consideration for NASA's astronaut team. The X-15 was constructed to investigate the barrier between atmospheric aviation and space aviation, achieving heights beyond 50 miles where traditional aircraft couldn't function. Adams's mission, labeled Flight 3-65-97, required him to achieve a height of 250,000 feet while examining a new ultraviolet stellar imaging test and assessing the aircraft's directional controls in the almost complete vacuum of space. The mission schedule appeared standard by X-15 criteria, but multiple circumstances would merge to form a fatal scenario. At 10:30 in the morning, Adams's X-15 was detached from the wing of a altered B-52 aircraft at 45,000 feet above the Mojave Desert. He quickly activated the XLR-99 rocket motor, which generated 57,000 pounds of push and propelled the aircraft to more than 3,800 miles per hour. While the X-15 ascended sharply through the atmospheric layers, Adams communicated standard motor capability and aircraft management. The rocket aircraft achieved its scheduled height of 266,000 feet, formally penetrating space and rendering Adams the initial individual to perish during a space journey. Nevertheless, throughout the high-altitude section of the journey, something malfunctioned with the aircraft's orientation control mechanism. The X-15 started an unintended rotation that Adams initially failed to detect because the sparse atmosphere at that height offered almost zero aerodynamic response. The craft's directional control mechanism intended to supply control in space wasn't operating correctly, and Adams discovered himself in a gradually advancing crisis that would become lethal. While the X-15 started its fall back into the atmospheric layers, the rotation became more evident, producing the aircraft to enter a tailspin. Adams tried to remedy the difficulty using the aircraft's traditional aerodynamic controls, but at such extreme height and velocity, they were mostly useless. Ground operators at Edwards Air Force Base monitored the aircraft's irregular trajectory on detection equipment and attempted to supply direction, but transmissions were sporadic because of the plasma covering enclosing the hypersonic aircraft. While the X-15 fell through 200,000 feet, it started meeting denser atmosphere, which ought to have permitted Adams to restore control using traditional flight controls. Nevertheless, the aircraft's angle of approach had grown so severe that it was basically traveling sideways through the air at more than 3,000 miles per hour. the aerodynamic pressures on the aircraft were massive and rising quickly as it penetrated denser air. At roughly 65,000 feet altitude while moving at Mach 3.5, the X-15 met G pressures that surpassed the structural boundaries of both the aircraft and the human form. The aircraft started to separate under the severe aerodynamic burdens, with sections breaking away from the primary body. Atoms, experiencing pressures surpassing 15 gs, probably became unconscious before the aircraft's ultimate separation. The primary debris of X-15-3 struck the Earth near Johannesburg, California, forming a depression multiple feet in depth. Adams's remains were discovered still secured in his ejection position, but the position had never been triggered. Examination showed that the aircraft's adaptive flight management mechanism had broken down during the high-altitude section of the journey, starting the rotation that Adams couldn't remedy. The catastrophe resulted in enhancements in aviator instruction for high-altitude aviation and superior reserve control mechanisms for craft functioning at the boundary of the atmospheric layers. Adams was posthumously given astronaut insignia for his journey, becoming the initial individual to receive them by perishing in space. If this content appealed to you, subscribe for comparable material and don't hesitate to leave recommendations for the upcoming content in the feedback section.